Are you a passionate business owner or entrepreneur ready to take your message to the world? Do you dream of launching your own podcast but don't know where to start? Introducing my 8-week Start Your Podcast program designed to guide you every step of the way in creating and launching your podcast. In this program, you'll learn the essential skills needed to craft engaging content, record high-quality episodes, and market your podcast effectively to reach your target audience. I will work closely with you, providing personalised guidance and feedback to ensure your podcast stands out in a crowded digital space. But hurry, spots are limited and applications for our upcoming cohorts are closing soon. Don't miss this opportunity to turn your podcast dreams into a reality and launch your podcast this summer. Visit our website donnaeade.com/apply and apply now to secure your spot in our next cohort. Together, let's make your podcasting vision a success. Welcome to Mic Action Podcast. I'm your host, Donna Eade, serial podcaster and mentor, here to guide you through the world of podcasting. Let's dive in. Welcome back to the Mic Action Podcast, everybody. I am super glad to have you here today for this episode, which we will be talking about 3 reasons why you should start podcasting today as a business owner. So podcasting, as you know, is one of my favorite things to do. I mean, I do have 3 episodes a week going out at the moment. So if I didn't enjoy it, there would be a real big problem. But there is another reason why I love podcasting, not just because I love to talk, but because podcasting is a growing business area, which is amazing to see. So to get us started, I wanted to talk about business growth. So the power of podcasting for business growth. Your podcast can do some wonderful things for your business, and growth is one of them. And if we just look at the podcast landscape to start with, I wanted to let you know that if you didn't know, there are 21.2 million listeners here in the UK, and there's actually 500 million listeners across the world at this point in time, which are fabulous numbers for us when we're looking at potentially only requiring 30, 300 X clients. You know your numbers, I don't, but for me, 30 clients a year would be an absolutely marvellous number for me to have. Perhaps you have a low-cost membership and you need 300 members to keep your business ticking over. But those numbers, 21.2 million here in the UK and 500 million worldwide, I think that that's a big enough pool for us to be drawing from. So the landscape is growing, and it has grown a lot. COVID certainly boosted podcasting in the UK. Back in 2021, there were a lot less people who knew what podcasting was. However, it had already started to grow at that point. So it's really interesting to see how much the listenership here in the UK is increasing. Now, there is something important to know, and if you know me, you know that I'm very realistic with things. I'm not somebody here who is trying to give you all of the best case scenarios and not give you the reality of the situation, because I want you going into podcasting with your eyes wide open. And that is that 48% of people in the UK who listen to podcasts are listening to be taught something. There's 58% that are looking to be entertained. So the largest portion of podcast listenership goes to comedy shows, which is a gender neutral genre, and then football for the men and true crime for the women. I don't know what that says about us as women, to be honest with you. However, those are the top 3 genres of podcasting here in the UK, and that's how it breaks down in the demographics. Now, that's not to say that a business podcast isn't going to do well, because 48% of people, so nearly 50%, are actually also on there looking to learn something. So that is still a huge portion of people. When you're looking at 21.2 million, nearly 50% of that's 10 million people listening because they want to learn something. And that is where your business podcast comes in. You're there to teach people something. Okay. So I wanted to be realistic, and we've all sort of seen those conversion rates where, you get 100 people into a funnel and then, only 2 convert and blah, 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 and all of those kind of percentages. So I wanted to give you some numbers so you could kind of work out in your head what that kind of looks like. But that actually when you get the right people in, if you've got 100 of the right people in that funnel, then that conversion rate would be much higher than 2%. So it's really interesting to know the numbers and to hear them and to have that overview. So it also depends on whether you're aiming at a UK market or whether you are a global business. So if you have the ability to be global, i.e. you work online, then you can actually talk to people outside of the UK. And one of the advantages of that for us is that a lot of other countries love a UK accent. That's if they realise that it's a UK and not Australian. So if you listen to my Mindset and Action podcast, you will know when I have guests on that have an accent, I'm always raving about how wonderful it is to hear their accent. And you will often hear them turn around and say, well, I really like your accent, or you've got a great accent too, because we really enjoy hearing accents that aren't our own. So by actually aiming yourself at a global audience, when you have an accent that is based here in the UK, you are probably going to attract listeners outside of your country. And so for me, I know that I have listeners in Germany, I have listeners in South Africa, I have listeners in America, I have listeners in Canada, and I have some listeners in Australia, and I have some other European countries listen in as well. So hello to all of you. I thank you so much for listening. So there is lots of diversity there with the people who listen to my podcast, which means that I have the opportunity to nurture that audience and sell to that audience. And you have that opportunity with your podcast as well. So if you have been focused on being here in the UK and you want to go global, a podcast is a great way to open that door for you. The other thing that a podcast does, and I talk about this a lot, is that it helps to establish your authority and your expertise in your industry. If you're releasing a podcast every week on what it is that you do, you are going to be showcasing your ability to know and understand your topic. So by doing that, you are cementing in your listeners' mind that you are an authority and an expert in this area. So when they are looking for somebody to help them with that area, they're more likely to come to you and remember you because they listen to you on a weekly basis. And you do get to build a strong, loyal community around your podcast and around your brand. And it's not necessarily a community that is connected to each other. So unless you're going to sort of start a Facebook group or maybe a Patreon group or something like that, but they're connected to you. It's that back and forth connection. So getting them to reach out to you on Instagram, sending you DMs and things like that, emailing you. Those are connections that you get to have with your audience through your podcast, and that can have a global effect as well. So the second thing to look at is connection and engagement with your audience. So being able to connect and engage with your audience is really, really important. And I think we have all learned by now that social media is not the most stable of places for us to do that, with it disappearing, with hacking going on, with the two-factor authentication, with verification, all of these things that kind of put barriers in the way of us actually getting to be with our community. And even so much as, my business bestie, she has a wonderful group. I've spoken about it before on my other podcast, and she realized this week or last week that actually she can no longer third-party stream into her group to have guests on. So she was using StreamYard to be able to go live in her group, also has used Zoom before, and she could use neither of those to go live in her group anymore because Facebook have disabled third-party access to groups. And that's across the board, so you can't schedule into groups anymore using a third-party app either, which is just reducing our ability to provide value to our communities, and that boggles my mind. So there are restrictions and other things in place on social media that make it very difficult for us to establish that strong connection and have it be stable, because it's an unstable environment. So if you want that, a podcast is a great way to start building that connection, because you can create a Facebook group or a Patreon group. You can even tell people where you listen. So for me, I listen on Good Pods. And if you go over to Good Pods, it's an app that you can download and you can listen to your podcasts on it. But it's very much similar to a social media platform where you have a profile. You can go and follow other people in the app. So you could come and follow me as a podcast host. You will then get notifications when I upload things on there, and I can follow other people and I can connect with my audience. So I can follow my audience that follow me, and we can have dialogue, and each episode you can rate and review and I can reply to those. So we can have a full-on conversation over there. And so if you want to do that, then come over to Good Pods and find me over there. I really enjoy the platform to listen to my podcasts and to be able to feed back to hosts on there with some reviews and such like. So it depends on where you want to build a community, but even if it's not necessarily community that you're building, rather you want one-to-one interaction with your audience, you are speaking to them on a weekly basis and you can request that they speak back. And if you are compelling enough with what you're talking about, and if they are passionate enough about what they've got to say, they're going to start talking back to you. And it doesn't always happen immediately. If it does, then that's fantastic, but it doesn't always happen immediately. There is this level of trust that has to be built over time for them to know that actually you're going to respond to them. So for example, I actually really have a wonderful podcast that I follow. I'm not going to name it because I want to tell you this story and be transparent about it. But there's a podcast that I listen to and I absolutely love it, and I love the host and I love what she stands for. She would often say, come over and talk to me on Instagram, and I would go over and talk to her on Instagram. I would send her a DM and she would DM me back, and I really enjoyed having that connection. It made it feel like we were much closer than we actually are, because I see DMs as things that you do with your friends. It felt very much like we had that intimate connection. Now, she decided to take a sabbatical from social media, and I knew that was happening. So I wasn't sending her messages through that time. But when I did send a couple when I thought she was back, I was getting like a heart in reply, or, maybe a 2-word answer. And it wasn't that I was asking for conversation. I was just tagging her in a post, which previously she had said, oh my God, that's great. Keep going. You're doing great. And was excited and encouraging. Suddenly I was getting, a heart to the story and not getting a response from her. And that's because she wasn't back yet. And that kind of made me feel a certain way, because suddenly her team was in the DMs replying, and I don't know her team. And for them to be replying and not her to be replying was jarring for me. It made me feel a certain way. And so now I'm not sending emails, sending messages to her in that way. I did actually send one, replied to one of her stories and asked a question, and I got an answer back, but I don't know that was her now. I haven't got that confidence that I'm speaking to her and not one of her employees, which is a shame, because that's now put another barrier between me and her. So as a podcaster, if you want to build that intentional relationship with your audience, you can, but it's a fragile relationship that can get spoiled if you don't nurture it in the right way. So that's really important to consider as well. I've spoken before about the intimate nature of audio format of content, so I'm not going to go over that all again, but just know that creating that intimate connection with somebody through the audio format means that you are building up that level of trust quite quickly. And that is, even if you're not getting the responses you think that you should be getting from people, don't feel like, oh, it's not working, because how many times have you sort of sat and nodded along to something and felt like, yeah, absolutely, I completely agree with you, but you don't go over to social and start interacting. You don't go and send them a message about it. So often that happens, and we're all so busy. So don't think that it's not working because you're not necessarily getting instant feedback or getting those replies. People are listening, and we say it about social, people are lurkers. They lurk in the background, they're listening, they're testing you out, they're seeing what it's all about before they decide to take the next step. But by consistently showing up and delivering value, they can rely on you to do that. And it means that when you have got something that they want to talk to you about, they're going to feel really comfortable in doing that. So the other thing is leveraging your podcast for branding and marketing purposes. So this is such a big one for businesses, branding and marketing. Often when I am in groups and we are asked the question like, what's the biggest thing that is causing you problems in your business right now? There are usually one of two answers to that, and it's either sales or marketing. Those are the two biggies that people really struggle with, and your podcast is a great thing to help you with your marketing. So some of you may have noticed recently that both this podcast, very quickly in fact, and my other podcast have had a bit of a facelift. I have changed my branding. I have tried to solidify a brand for my business rather than having one podcast brand, another podcast brand, and then my website brand. I've tried to bring it all in together and make it more cohesive. So I hope that you're liking that. But the thing with a podcast is because it's going out every week, those colors, that image is going to be ingrained on somebody's mind. So when they see it on social media where you're sharing clips of the podcast, it's going in, it's consistently being reinforced in their brain, which means that you then become a recognizable brand to your audience. So having a strong brand image for your podcast that links in with your business is really important. And I do think that it should link to your business. I don't think it should be a separate branding from your business. I think it should incorporate into it. Use your brand colors, use your brand fonts to make your podcast branding really support your brand of your business. And on the subject of branding, your podcast literally is the vehicle for showing off your brand voice. So I had the absolute pleasure of being in the room when Marianne Hartley spoke about the heart and soul of your brand. And she spoke about the 5 senses and making sure that your brand hits all 5 senses. Well, if you are online and you don't show up on social vocally or visibly, if you don't have a podcast, if you don't have a video show, then your brand becomes very two-dimensional. It's these images and these colors, and that's kind of all people are getting. But when you are talking to your audience through social media, on Reels, however it is, or through a podcast, and you're showing up, then they're getting that brand voice, they're getting that tonality, they are understanding the personality of the brand that you are showing up as. And that is really powerful, because to me, hearing somebody's voice just resonates on a different level to reading their words, because you're hearing it from their perspective, from their personality and their tone. Like, how many times has somebody sent you a text message and you've misinterpreted the tone? Like, you're not in a great mood. Maybe you snapped at them when you sent a message and they sent one back, and you just assumed that they'd read the snappy message and were responding in a snappy way, but they didn't actually take your message as snappy. It gets all confused in text, even if you know somebody. So if you look at that and talk to a brand that you don't know, then how are you supposed to decipher the tone from words on a page? It's much more difficult. It's not impossible, and great copywriters can definitely do this, but having something that is vocal, is audio based that you can share with people so they can actually get to know you and who you are and your personality and your humour, that is going to be extra special and just bring some more cohesiveness to your brand overall and just bring it all together. I absolutely love that about podcasting. So there are many businesses out there that use podcasting to really be a vehicle for their business. So I'm thinking about the likes of Amy Porterfield. You know, her podcast is front and center, one of the most important pillars of her business. It brings new people in, it gets them into her funnel, and it gets her clients. And it's a great vehicle for her to do that. And she has been doing that for over 10 years now. So it's an amazing vehicle for her, and she uses it so effectively in her business. She introduced a second episode not long ago. So she does a short episode. So there's 2 episodes that go out a week. You know, she had big numbers that she wanted to hit. She was working with companies to get her downloads up. She sort of works really hard on her podcast. She works really hard. She has staff members that are dedicated to her podcast now because that is how important it is to her business. There are other people that also use it as a very powerful tool in their business. So the likes of Jenna Kutcher, Ed Milet has a fabulous podcast. There are so many podcasters out there in the business world that have podcasts that really are a vehicle for driving their audience into that top of funnel area where you can start to nurture them and get to know them and understand them and see how you can help them. So as well as the branding, it's the marketing, it's the getting it out there. So people are using it for their business. Do they talk about it on social media? Yes, they do. Do they talk about it on Pinterest? Yes, they do. Your podcast is literally a fountain of content for you. So in this world where content marketing is one of the highest sort of sources of marketing that we use these days, social, etc., your podcast can really generate lots of content for you. So for every single episode that I do, I produce at least 10 Pinterest pins for that episode. So that's 10 individual pins going out talking about one podcast episode. I have sound bites that I put out. I have regular posts. I have quotes to do with the podcast. There are so many different avenues of speaking about the podcast. It's literally, there is never ending content. Like if I didn't want to do any social media for the next 12 months, I could literally hire a VA and say, you know, start going through the back catalogue of my podcast episodes for the last year, pull out quotes, put them on posts, pull out sound bites, put those as reels, you know, and just do that for the next 12 months. And she would have enough content to do that. It would be easy for her to put a post every day on every platform and still have things to talk about. So it is one of those things that is just, it's what you want to do with it. It's an almost a never-ending source of marketing potential for you. And I say never-ending source because I just don't think, unless you have a marketing department or somebody who does your marketing for you, you could never actually pull everything out that you could use from one podcast episode and put it into your marketing on your own. I just don't think it's possible. Like I know that I underutilize my podcast episodes, so can guarantee that other people do as well. So there is so much there that you can use to market yourself and your business, and the potential is really there. And then the last thing I want to touch on is monetizing your podcast. And for me, one of the biggest ways that you can do this is by talking about what it is that you do and what you sell. So for me, it's my podcast program. It's the 8-week podcasting program, currently open for the spring cohorts. So if you don't get in on these next 2 cohorts, there's not going to be an opportunity until September. So if you want to get your podcast up and running by summer, you can come and join me in my 8-week program at donnaeade.com/apply. There is a special offer for those of you who apply before the deadline, and that is available on that link as well for you to see. So if you go over there, would be thrilled to help you create and launch your podcast. So that's the number one way to use your podcast as a revenue stream. There are also affiliate opportunities. So if you're an affiliate for anything, you can obviously talk about that on your podcast and share it with your audience. I would caution affiliate stuff. Just make sure that it's actually aligned and it makes sense for your audience, because if it doesn't, then it's not going to work and you're not going to get any uptake on it. So it's going to be pointless. But also it could end up annoying your audience and you might lose listeners. So if it doesn't fit with your podcast. So for example, I hear, there is obviously now ads that you can have on your podcast. So if you wanted to go into kind of an ad situation, very much similar to YouTube, where advertisers will pay a podcast host money to advertise on their podcasts that are hosted on their site, and then people will sign up to the advert pool, and you will get adverts on your podcast and you don't really know what they are. And I was listening to a podcast the other day from a lady who I listened to about the law of attraction, and up popped a HelloFresh advert, and I'm like, what's this got to do with what you do? It's like completely disjointed to me and it just bothers me. So, for me, I just don't want podcasts to become YouTube in that respect of like having loads of adverts. So I think that might be a personal thing, but I think if me as a listener is getting annoyed at those kind of adverts that just don't align with the podcast I'm listening to, that's, not good to me. I don't want to listen to that. Whereas if you had an advert in your podcast that you've controlled, that you have sorted, so more of a sponsorship or a partnership, then you can control what that business is and what the advert is. So for example, Amy Porterfield often does adverts with HubSpot. That makes sense. She is an online marketing podcast and she is talking about a tool that you can use in your business to help make it more efficient. So that makes sense. Do I get annoyed with it still? Yeah, a little bit, but it makes sense. So I'm not mad at it, So make sure that you're thinking about these things when you're taking on sponsorships and partnerships. So you can do sponsorships where people will pay you for you to give them an advertising slot of maybe 30 seconds where you talk about their product or service for 30 seconds for 6 episodes, 12 episodes, however many episodes you want to do, and they will give you a certain amount of money for you to do that. So that's a revenue opportunity. There are other options as well. So if you have digital products or if you have a book, I've done a couple of talks now where I've talked about how authors and podcasters, podcasts and books are match made in heaven because they really can play well off each other. So you can use your podcast to sell your book as well. So there is lots of potential revenue possibilities with podcasting. I wouldn't say if you're coming into podcasting thinking, do you know what? Rather than doing my business, I just want to do a podcast and I want to make money at that. That is probably not the way to go unless you are somebody who has got an audience of millions of people already and you are, somebody who's going to get huge downloads that businesses are going to pay you thousands of pounds to access. Probably not likely. So, my audience tend to be small business owners who are looking to just reach more people with their message. And for that, it's really awesome. And you have the potential to add in some of those other things. So last year I was an affiliate for Amy Porterfield's DCA program. And so that featured on my podcast for around 8 weeks. And that was aligned with the Mindset and Action podcast because it was talking about ways that you can streamline your business. So to streamline your business, instead of giving out all your one-to-one time and feeling overwhelmed, you can create a course that will help you to help more people without giving more of your time. So streamlining the process. So that aligned with the purpose of my podcast. I have also talked about Amy's book. So that wasn't a paid thing. That was a I wanted to help her out with her book launch, and it meant that I got to have her on my podcast. So I was absolutely thrilled. So I spoke about her book for a little time. I had her come on the podcast to talk about it. So there are ways you can monetize and make use of your podcast within your business as a revenue stream. But in the first instance, for my audience, I believe our number one reason for podcasting is to share our message and get it to a wider audience. If that audience likes us and wants to hear more from us and wants to get on our email list and wants to know more about what we do, then that is the number one way we make money through our podcast. Anything else is an added extra, but be careful with it. You don't want to turn off your audience by having adverts that don't apply to them, by having adverts. For me, middle of the podcast adverts are my most annoying. I don't mind one at the beginning, I don't mind one at the end, but if you stick it in the middle and you stick more than one, like if it's a 50-minute podcast and actually there's 2 middle breaks, it winds me up no end, especially if I'm in the car because I can't skip them because I'm driving. So just be mindful of that, and your downloads will show it. If your listeners are really bothered by it, you'll see the downloads go down. And the problem is once they go down, how do you then get them back up? If you go, okay, I see they don't like that, so I won't do that again. How do you get them back in and let them know, that was a test. It didn't work. It's fine. Come back. I'm not doing that again. So you just need to be careful when you are looking at the opportunities that are coming in with that. Okay, so today we have had a look at 3 reasons why podcasting is a must for business owners. We looked at podcast for business growth. We looked at your connection and engagement with your audience. We looked at leveraging your podcast for your branding and your marketing. So that is it for this episode, guys. If you enjoyed it, please rate and review where you listen. Do reach out to me on Instagram, Donna_Eade_. If you've got any questions about what we've spoken about today, I am absolutely here to answer them for you. And if you want to come and join me for 8 weeks, I would love to spend 8 weeks with you talking all about podcasting and getting your show up and running. You can go over to donnaeade.com/apply for all of the details. Until next time, bye for now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Mike Action podcast and are enjoying the series so far. If you are, make sure to drop a review where you listen and share it with a friend. Until next time.